Comrades, thanks very much. Well, now, before we open up on world perspectives, we're going to have a short film.
Greetings to the 2014 Congress of the Socialist Party of England and Wales. This is Shama Sawant speaking to you today from Socialist Alternative. Late last year, I was elected as a Socialist Alternative candidate to the Seattle City Council, the first open socialist elected in years and the first socialist elected in Seattle in a century. Our historic campaign in Seattle was a direct challenge to the Republicans and Democrats, both parties of big business. We ran a campaign for a $15 an hour minimum wage, taxing the rich to fund education, and for affordable housing and rent control. Our victory has shaken the political establishment and has stirred thousands all across the nation into action. Our movement here in Seattle was inspired by fast food workers who began the nationwide Fight for 15 just over a year ago. Low-wage workers show phenomenal courage and sacrifice every time they speak out, demonstrate, and strike. These unorganized workers, calling for 15 and a union, know full well that the bosses can and will retaliate. The movement won a partial victory of $15 an hour last year in SeaTac, a city neighboring Seattle, and simultaneously helped us win the City Council seat. Out of this momentum, we have organized 15 Now, a grassroots campaign with the support of the majority of local unions and community organizations. 15 Now is leading the charge in the streets and neighborhoods and building a mass movement by organizing neighborhood action groups. Our battle is an expression of worldwide anger against injustice and inequality. The more far-sighted capitalist commentators are correctly in fear of the bubbling cauldron of anger. Our job is to bring this anger to the fore and turn it into a massive fight back and into organizations rooted in the struggle of the working class. Here in Seattle, attacks by business are just starting. We know business will fight tooth and nail. But at the same time, opportunities for building our forces are also opening up, and we have to be prepared to seize upon them. Let's look to the breakthrough here in the US, look to the inspiring battles of the South African working class, the miners' uprising, and the new electoral challenges posed by WASP and NUMSA. Look to trade union and youth work in England and Wales and throughout the Committee for Workers International. The secret of our successes are clear socialist ideas, the perspectives of the CWI, a boldness and an audacity to fight for our class, and the willingness of our comrades to make enormous sacrifices. Good luck with your conference and solidarity to you.
Comrade Chair and comrades, I don't think we could have had a better introduction to this Congress than the words of Comrade Sharma. She epitomizes the new period that we've entered, both from an objective point of view, but also in terms of the possibilities that exist for the CWI and, of course, for our party in England and Wales. But I'd like to start my contribution by just quoting for your benefit from a newspaper of exactly 1 week ago, and it reads, first Tahrir Square, then last year's Gezi protests in Istanbul, and now Kiev, Caracas, Sarajevo and Bangkok. People have been taking to the streets and holding their governments accountable. A wave of popular mobilization is gathering pace, and in an age of falling voter rolls and political apathy, you would have to be stony-hearted not to feel a thrill at the sight. The article then goes on to say that these events show the fundamental Leninist insight still holds. Nothing can be done without organization. Is that from an editorial in The Socialist? or in Socialism Today. No, it's from an editorial in the Financial Times. Does it mean that the writer is about to apply to join the Socialist Party and the CWI? Sadly, no, because if he writes for the Financial Times, then he'll bring some resources to this party. But that is not likely to happen. What this demonstrates is the point that we have made many times in discussions like this, that the far-sighted representatives of the bourgeois, the commentators, draw the same conclusions from the situation as we do, the Marxists, but from an opposite class standpoint. These comments are motivated by the events in the Ukraine, which have been skewed by the outbreak of nationalism, possible ethnic conflict, and even perhaps a new war. That is not the most likely, but that is lodged in this situation. Nevertheless, the original movement in the Ukraine, in Kiev and elsewhere, there were big elements of revolution in that movement itself. Even Putin, when he was commenting on these events, made the following points. If it's a revolution, what does that mean? It's hard not to agree that a new government is appearing in this country, just like Russia after 1917. It's an ironical remark. But he then goes on to say, we didn't sign any documents with this government. But the very fact that Putin has spoken about revolution, the fact that the press has headlines about revolution in Kiev and the Ukraine, is legitimizing for those workers who are viewing this situation the idea of revolution itself. My own granddaughter commented to us, this reminds me of what we did in the student revolt in Britain when we occupied Millibank. It's a correct conclusion to draw and shows the way that the movement of working people are threatening to spill over the narrow banks, if you like, of bourgeois democracy itself. And we have a Mexican comrade here as well. And in the discussion that we had with this comrade a few weeks ago, we made the point about the development of militias amongst the Mexican workers and farmers against the drug barons and the way that the police have intervened to stop that movement, even though it would fulfill quite a useful social function, if you like. Now our comrades there, we could call them our comrades in the sense that we're discussing with them, have intervened in this movement, have tried to give it a direction and tried to steer it in the correct way. Ukraine now seems to have taken a turn for the worse, much as the previous revolutionary explosions in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, because there was no independent leadership of the working class, and because in all revolutions, it's not a straightforward process. You have revolution and you have elements of counter-revolution almost from the beginning. Look at the events in Egypt now. In effect, the Mubarak security state, or large parts of it, have been restored in Egypt after 3 years of revolution. That doesn't mean to say that things have stood still, because we see the independent movement of the working class in the last couple of weeks of transport workers, of bus workers, of the government resigning, and now a sixth government will probably come to power, indicating the instability that exists in Egypt itself. The same process in Tunisia. And it was very striking that the leader of the independent unions said we need a third revolution in Egypt. These independent unions are important. Unfortunately, the leader of this union joined temporarily the government, but at the moment the working class are moving to free itself, if you like, from the shackles of the state. In fact, in the Ukraine now, you have to say, visibly at least, right-wing nationalism seems to be predominating. But nevertheless, it hasn't hidden the process of revolution that took place. Svoboda, the right-wing sector is now Svoboda and the right wing in the right-wing sector now have 5 positions in the new government. Putin, of course, has played on this and has said that the Nazis are in control in Kiev. That's an exaggeration. And by the way, the Nazis have been visible, and the right have been visible in the former Soviet Union, in Russia itself. We had an experience of this when we visited Russia in 1998, when we had a comrade with us at that stage, and that neo-Nazis, one of whom was from East Germany, attacked us in the Moscow metro, actually endangered our lives, so much so that the Guardian the next day ran a headline, that's the British Guardian, ran the headline, veteran British Trotskyist threatened in Moscow. I objected to that headline, largely to the use of the term veteran in that context. Of course, the history of the Ukraine is very, very important in shaping the current situation. If you look at the small nations, the big powers, there's so much small change to the big powers, the fate of the small nationalities of Europe, of Eastern Europe, and so on. Look at the way in 1954, Khrushchev, after a 15-minute discussion, incidentally in the Politburo of the US, decided to hand over the Ukraine, decided to hand over the Crimea to the Ukraine. Also, the present gang in power in Kiev passed a law or proposed a law discriminating against Russian, discriminating against the language. This, by the way, was an imitation of what had happened in the course of the developments in Eastern Europe, in Latvia, Estonia, so on and so forth. The last word has not yet been spoken in the Ukraine and elsewhere, for that matter, in Eastern Europe. Trotsky, commenting on the eve of the First World War, in retrospect that is, mentioned the discussion that he had with a group of bourgeois just before the outbreak of the First World War. And they believed that the First World War would result in revolution. But they believed they'd be able to manage this revolution. They reckoned then, without the presence of the Bolshevik Party, which was not on their radar in the main, just as we're not on their radar at the present time, perhaps with the exception of the US at the present time. And equally, the bourgeois underestimate us and the working class in the period that we're going into. Remember, before the First World War broke out, with all the muck and the filth and the victims of that war, we had the first Balkan War, or the continuation of the Balkan War, and yet despite all of this, 4 years later, we had the outbreak of the Russian Revolution itself. This provides a timely example of how ultimately the working class can overcome the poison of sectarian strife. And it's not just in history. We have a striking example in the region, if you like, of the Ukraine, in the Balkans itself. We all remember the slaughter of the Balkan War, of the internecine strife between the different nationalities. And yet there's a marvelous movement broken out in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the course of the last couple of weeks. In Tuzla, all the nationalities have acted together. And when one commentator said, well, isn't there a national ethnic division? A youth said in Bosnia, finally, the nationalist narrative of the political parties is being swallowed by the social narrative on the streets. Even more to the point, a huge banner has been raised in Tuzla, and it mocks Bosnia's ethnocentric politics, and it declares, quote, I am hungry in 3 languages. Could you get a better expression of the edge, of the instinct of working people coming together in a struggle at the present time? We, of course, support the right of self-determination of the peoples of the Crimea as we do any other entity. We also, by the way, at the same time, fight for the support or fight to defend the ethnic minorities like the Tatars, who suffered terribly at the hands of the gang of Stalinists who deported them to Siberia in the past. In a situation like this, we have to act with extreme care in the formulations of the slogans and the demands that we put forward. What might seem as a good slogan in one area could repel workers in another. In other words, we have to have a nuanced situation when we're facing such a complicated position like this. For instance, demands about denouncing the Russian troops would not go down exactly well in the Crimea. Calling for the withdrawal of the troops would not be understood by the peoples of the Crimea itself. We are not separatists. We stand, of course, for the independence. If the peoples of a country want to be independent from a particular entity. But we also say that is a step towards a confederation, or a democratic socialist confederation of the region, in the way that we do, for instance, in Scotland, or we do in Spain at the present time. We stand on all occasions for the right of self-determination, of course, but we stress the class standpoint as far as that is concerned. These events, comrades, have read, as Ken remarked, when he opened up this discussion, one of the messages from our German comrades indicated, show the changed situation with the clash of different imperialisms over the Ukraine. If you like, what we've said in our documents in the past, it is an indication of the development of a new Cold War. To be more precise, it's more at this stage like the outbreak of a chilly war, rather than a Cold War and a clash of different imperialist powers. Ironically, this comes, of course, on the anniversary of the First World War itself. And in the run-up to that war, there were people who were arguing, well, because of the binding together of the economies of Britain and of Germany, a world war was impossible. That does not follow, because in the process of integration, there can also be competition, intense competition between the different imperialist powers, if you like. The same, for instance, exists in relation to China and Japan, where there is a colossal interpenetration of the economies of Germany, of Japan and China. But that does not mean to say that there could not be a military clash. In fact, that is likely, and even maybe a small war. Not a world war. You could have, in the course of that movement, a clash between Japan and China, even maybe accidentally, because of the build-up that is taking place of a nuclear exchange. Not the most likely, but it's lodged in that situation. What is demonstrated by these events is US imperialism is no longer capable of establishing its preeminence on a world scale. We're in a new bipolar world. Putin wishes to establish the class, on a different class basis, aspects of the former Soviet Union in the so-called near abroad. The US has intervened with the help of Europe, but has completely miscalculated about the situation itself. Like the French Bourbons, they've learnt nothing and they've forgotten nothing. They've forgotten the example of Ossetia in Georgia, when Putin intervened and came out strengthened from that exchange. And it's not an accident that people like Kissinger and also Michael Heseltine on question Time last week, when the question came up of what to do, he said, in effect, there's nothing that we can do because of the economic stake that we have in Russia. For instance, West Germany, it's no accident that Merkel is very cool on any action taken against Russia, because Germany in particular is dependent upon the oil and gas that comes from Russia itself. The US is weakened militarily. It now has the smallest army since Pearl Harbor. Of course, it strengthened its position in technology, but it cannot put the boots on the ground, as was done in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now the withdrawing from that arena. Europe's military options are limited and puny. Even less so are the options of the British capitalist class. How farcical that you are the spokesman, Haig, Mr. Vague, talking about an intervention against Russia and measures to be taken, and then some civil servant walks into 10 Downing Street and reveals the plans of Cameron, in which, in effect, it is written down we should do absolutely nothing for fear of endangering our position in the situation there. Let's be clear about this. The Ukraine was in an impoverished position before this situation broke out. The population has dropped by 6 million since 1991, so appalling was the drop in production and the poverty in that country. But what it indicates, the underlying factors that have led to this clash, not directly and not immediately, of course, is the developments economically. And this points up the way that the situation there is linked to the economic situation, but also the wider position of the developments in the world economy at this moment in time. In the past, it was possible to have a certain demarcation between the different regions of the world. Advanced industrial world, neo-colonial, Europe, US, Japan, all moving, if you like, at a different tempo. Of course, those differences still exist, the rhythm and so on. But increasingly, the world is dominated by the world market. It's being carried to an incredible length by the development of globalization. Ultimately, these developments shape the development of events itself. The huge development of the productive forces now, more than any other time in history, come up against the limitations of private ownership and of the nation-state. Obama reflects this, where American imperialism is looking to a trade pact, really, throughout the world. He talked about the pivot away from the Atlantic towards the Pacific, and then, at the same time, spoke about a new trade agreement with Europe. There's massive opposition to this in the US itself. Working people there remember the effects of NAFTA. 60,000 factories went south through the organization of the North American Free Trade Association. And the position of the working class has, of course, been affected by this situation. In 1950, the US had something like 30% of its total production in manufacturing industry. Now it's down to 10% at the present time. Then we heard recently, up to the very recent period, well, the world is now decoupled. We're going to be saved by the developments that take place in the emerging markets, in the so-called BRICS, the acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now the bourgeois are openly contemptuous of the role of the BRICS. It's now referred to as that bloody ridiculous investment concept. Such is the disillusionment with the BRICS at the moment. Now, of course, a new acronym has taken its place. The MINTs, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey. Yet already this year, we've seen a massive outflow of investment from the safe havens in the wake of the US decision to taper quantitative easing as the CWI predicted would happen. The governor of the Central Bank of India is complaining now about the selfishness of the US and the rich world, which is just pulling the plug or pulling the carpet from under the feet of the countries of the neo-colonial world. He recognizes, as we recognize, this will give a push to the movements of the masses. The deteriorating economic situation will give a push to the movement of the masses in the neo-colonial world in the next period. What we face today is a generalized crisis of capitalism that affects all the sectors of the world. 6 months ago, the IMF was talking about a 3-speed world economy. The ILO, I haven't got time to deal with this, in a recent report says the jobless recovery is with us for years. That's the conclusion that the experts of the system have drawn. Europe is mired in crisis, with the lucky exception of one country, Germany, which has got back to the position pre the crisis itself. The US has not established what they've called economic escape velocity. There's been no real substantial growth. There's been no cutting of unemployment. As a matter of fact, the real situation has been covered up in employment by millions dropping out of the labour force itself, with 42 million living on the breadline in the US at the present time. Asia is also now plunged into crisis. I haven't got the time to develop this. It will be raised in the course of the discussion itself. But we saw from the film, and we ourselves in our analysis have shown, the enormous importance of economic developments in the world, but specifically in the US, through the development of perspectives for the US itself. Japan, through Abe economics, was supposed to establish an escape route for world capitalism. Yes, there's been a growth of 1%, but that's half of what was expected by the Japanese government itself. The opposition of the working class is growing in Japan. It's in its first stages. In China, the economy is slowing down. There's no time really to develop this. But the opposition of the working class is increasing, with the demonstrations in the last couple of weeks of workers who were arrested for proclaiming socialism good, long live socialism, have automatically been arrested by the Chinese police. The national question now has come onto the agenda in China, as shown by the events in Xinjiang, or rather the manifestation of the national question in Xinjiang, following the terrorist incident that existed in Tiananmen Square. China, moreover, is now beginning to be supplanted for an investment for cheap wages in Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam, and even in the hinterland of China itself. The shadow banking system mirrors the position that we've had in the capitalist West in the past, of an enormous piling up of hidden debts of over 200%, which will have an effect at a certain stage. As we've said many times, this poses the question of revolution. A drop in production will result in mass unemployment. A continuation of the present situation that cannot be met by the Chinese state will cause what we said in the past was a revolution of rising expectations. Anyhow, there will be a movement of opposition. Interest rates from a world point of view are at the lowest level in history. As the comrades are aware, it's the lowest for 3 centuries in Britain. Capital has never been cheaper, and yet the bourgeois are refusing to invest. The parasitic character of capitalism is revealed in this process. Marx once said that the capitalists are the trustees of the system, and their trustee, if you like, from us, by implication, is the development of the productive forces. So long as they can develop science, the organization of labor and technique, then there's still a role for capitalism. They've now exhausted that role. It's shown in just one figure, where rather than invest, US companies have given £600 billion back to the shareholders rather than invest it in plant and machinery itself. Now, I don't intend to continue the discussion here on the falling rate of profit. I can hear a loud sigh of relief. But I cannot resist making 1 or 2 comments. This issue is already an exploded shell as far as we're concerned, but in the discussion, much was made of Deloitte. Deloitte, in a recent report, and Deloitte was allegedly proving the case for the rate of profit falling at this stage. In the latest report, it makes the point about 1/3 of the world's biggest non-financial groups are sitting on most of 2.8 trillion gross cash pile, according to the study by advisory firm Deloitte. Now, that, in our opinion, indicates the problem of capitalism today. There is no profitable outlet. That does not mean to say we oppose, theoretically, Marx's idea on the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. We defend this. And in a certain sense, the present crisis is rooted in the drop in the rate of profit in the past, but it's not the explanation of the present crisis. There's a colossal surplus with nowhere to go. The bourgeois are trying to overcome this problem by massive privatization, which we all have experienced in Britain and in other countries where the CWI operate. But it is as nothing compared to the plans of the bourgeois today, as mapped out recently in The Economist, which is proposing, half seriously I would say, a privatization program of $9 trillion. To give you a picture of what that actually represents, that's the total gross domestic product of China. They are putting that program forward as the only lifeline for the development of capitalism. It will ruin the working people's lives. It will produce chaos, as we know, by the privatizations that are taking place in Britain. But it's the only way forward they can see to the dilemma that they face of the enormous accumulated surplus, which is nowhere to go in a world that is closed off from it. And moreover, what is posed now alongside of this is the issue once more of technology, which was a big issue in the 1930s, and in my lifetime it's been a big issue about automation and so on. But they solved that problem because all the techniques that were developed in the boom of 1950 to 1975, they already existed in the 1930s. They could not be implemented in disease capitalism at that stage. It took a world war and the destruction of the productive forces, so on and so forth, to create the possibility for capitalism to develop this. There's no possibility of a war, now of a world war, although there can be regional wars. And the dilemma, to me, was summed up in a conversation between Walter Reuther, who was the leader of the car workers' unions in America, and the head of GM, when he was being shown around a factory, and there was a certain amount of automation. And the head of the factory said, well, if we implement this, where are you going to get your union dues from? And Reuther thought for a little moment, and he said, fine, but where are you going to sell your goods? In a technologically developed world of robots. The issue has reached such stages now that in the Financial Times you have articles that are virtually saying that the introduction of new technology in the US will destroy 47% of existing jobs. But what if we get the robots before they get us? Is the terminology that they're using. Even suggestions of forming a picket line to stop the robots from getting through to work in the factories itself. It shows the absurdity of capitalism. It shows the incapacity of capitalism to actually utilize the potential that's being built up by the labor of the working class. It reflects a new Luddism, if you like, but this time not on behalf of working people trying to save their jobs, but on behalf of capitalism itself. What, therefore, are the prospects for capitalism? In a word, bleak. And if you listen to the spokesman of the system itself, in The Observer, a Keynesian economist, Walter Regan, actually had a Marxist speaking to a group of city men. And he quotes this Marxist. The man is Walter Sickert, I think it is, Wolfgang Streeck, rather. And he said, has capitalism seen its day? There is an open discussion in the ranks of the bourgeois in relation to this. Theoreticians of capitalism, insofar as they have them, like Larry Summers, envisage a protracted period of secular stagnation. This is another way to describe Japanization, the 2 lost decades of Japan. That's the prospects that are opening up for world capitalism. Others, like Adair Turner, former head of the CBI, openly say there's no alternative but debt-fueled growth in capitalism itself. And what does that mean? Continued instability, bubbles that collapse. There's even now a suggestion made where we'd like a little bit of inflation. That's ironical to those of us who came through the 1930s when inflation and the rise in prices were considered like the devil incarnate. And yet the bourgeois now are seriously suggesting that we need not too much inflation, just a little inflation that will force all those people who are saving at the moment but seeing their savings going down, when they see prices going up, they calculate, well, we'll go out and buy now because it'll be cheaper to buy now than it will buy later. And that, in turn, will have an effect on the market, and also it would inflate away debt as well. Some now are even in favour of the minimum wage in an article in the current issue of The Economist. Why? Because they face the problem of markets. There's an intractable world economic crisis now. And yet Bill Gates actually says we've never had it so good. That's true for him and a layer of plutocrats. It's true of the 85 individuals who could get onto a double-decker bus and have an income equal to half the population of the world, 3.5 billion people. 11 million homes are empty in Europe at the present time, twice the number of the official homeless. There is a blizzard of facts indicating how the rich flaunt their wealth, spending $1.7 trillion yearly on private airlines, on other luxuries like, not for them, by the way, Slimming World, with the weekly trudge for the dreaded weigh-in. No, 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 no. Luxury swimming clinics, 5-star hospitals, expeditions to Antarctica, bespoke safaris, and one Chinese tycoon actually spent $1.5 million on taking in 1,000 UNESCO historic sites. There's never been a period in history when there's been such inequality. One theoretician of the bourgeois said, well, there's no such a thing as equality in this life, not even in the graveyard, because Mozart was buried in a pauper's grave. So there's no such a thing as equality. Yes, in the capitalist world, in the kind of world we're trying to build, there will be equality in the real sense of the term. But our criticism is not just on equality. Our criticism is in the incapacity of the bourgeois to develop the productive forces and use the full potential which is at hand. But nevertheless, this growth in inequality, as we heard from Sharma, is exercising a profound effect on the outlook of the working class. Growing inequality was a big factor in our victory in Seattle. There's been talk about the development of a new middle class worldwide. Well, there was figures produced by Gillian Tett of the Financial Times that said this middle class is living on $10 to $100 a day. And really, that's taking account of the neo-colonial world. You cannot describe an income like that as middle class, certainly in the advanced industrial country. Americans on $70 a week, she says, wouldn't feel middle class. Wealth accumulation now, in the words of the Financial Times, is worthy of the 19th century robber barons. Never has the gap between the ruled and the rulers been greater than it is today. This is not an incidental factor, because it comes at the same time as millions of workers have lost their homes in the US, and not one banker has been indicted or imprisoned. It's a big mistake to think that this passes the working class by and doesn't have an enormous effect on their consciousness, even though it's not yet reflected, apart from our victory in Seattle, it's not yet reflected in a big movement of the working class. And undoubtedly, there's frustration, particularly, I would say, in our organization, not a weakening of our resolve or a preparedness to fight and prepare for the future, but there is, if you like, a growing frustration that 6 years into the crisis, the working class appears not to have decisively pushed back the capitalists. And I confess, when this crisis broke, we hoped that it would act like a clap of thunder on the consciousness and the movement of the working class. And it did. Now the capitalists are jeering. Look at the privations of the people of Ireland. And yet there's no big industrial movement taking place. Francis Fukuyama said, what's left of the left? What left is he talking about? The ex-Social Democrats, who could not be included by any stretch of the imagination in a genuine left. That's more and more reduced to us and a number of combative groups and the working class, if you like, in its opposition to capitalism. Then there are the lingering effects of the collapse of Stalinism, the decimation of the guiding layers. This meant that when the crisis broke in 2006, the working class was starting from a standing position. That's been enormously aggravated by the rotten leadership of the trade unions and the so-called labour movement, if you include the Labour Party itself. The national leaders, almost to a man and woman, are incapable of drawing correct conclusions from this crisis. At best, they see the current situation as a passing phase, and will return back to so-called normal. They do not realise that mass mobilisations is the only way that the working class can halt and push back the movement of the working class. If there's one single factor that separates this organisation, this party and our international, from all others, it's on the confidence that we have in the working class, which is not an emotional thing. It's a scientific appraisal of the position of the working class in capitalist society and the inevitability that they will move into struggle. The working class instinctively understands this. That's why we've had the colossal changes in the consciousness in Greece, in Spain, and in Portugal. In Europe at this stage, if we're going to realistically appraise the situation, there's a period of mild reaction. There's even the growth of the far right. The European elections will see the far right gain here in the form of UKIP, in the Netherlands, in France, and even in Spain we notice the right to abortion, the right to choose. Nobody would have envisaged that in Spain. After the overthrow of Franco, the right to choose is being taken away from women. And a ferocious struggle is being conducted, as on all the social issues. The most shocking fact I saw recently was a poll where 55% of students in France are considering voting for Le Pen, voting for the right. Why is that? Because they've been betrayed and let down by the so-called Socialist Party, by Hollande, who's openly referred to as the most unpopular president in recent French history itself. In Italy, 367,000 small businesses have closed. An astonishing 25% of industry has collapsed since 2008. Unemployment figures now very rapidly on the scale of Spain or the scale of Greece exists at the moment. On the other hand, remember, in Greece and in Spain, in Portugal and in Italy, we've had titanic strikes and general strikes. In Greece alone, we've had 31 general strikes. No leadership. Except us and similar groups at the base working in the working class itself. In Greece now, there's a profound feeling of disappointment that exists in that country. There are small strikes still taking place. But even the workers who are engaged in the struggle don't think that they can win. But they're not going to let the bastards get away with it. They're not going to let the capitalists get away with it. On the political front, Syriza now stands in the leading position in the polls. It's not very high, it's at 20%. But the most striking thing about Greece is the Syriza leader, Tsipras, has openly stated before the election, we want to share power. We don't want power alone. We want to share power. And he doesn't mean by that share it with the Communist Party, but with the democratic left and other pro-capitalist formations. What does this teach us? What does this teach us? That these people now are afraid of power. Just ponder what Lenin said in April 1917, when the Mensheviks said, who amongst us can take the power? And Lenin piped up and said, we will. They had 4% of the vote at that stage. Why did Lenin say that? Because like Trotsky, he had the imagination. He could envisage how the working class would move under the blows of big events. There's not an atom of this in the present leaders or ex-leaders or leaders of the ex-social democracy. Miliband is referred to as Francois Miliband now by The Economist, as evoking the spectacle of what happened to Miliband. And that, by the way, is an insult to Miliband, because Miliband carried through serious reforms and then was compelled by the pressure of the bourgeois to carry through counter-reforms as well. In Greece, we're at the head of a massive anti-fascist movement that is being mobilized now. We don't yet have a mass organization, but the specific weight of our party is tremendous. There are literally hundreds and thousands of workers who are watching us, not just in Greece, but in Britain and elsewhere. Look how we have created a marvelous platform to go forward in South Africa in the next period. We had a handful of people. Our movement was kept alive by people like Wiseman Hamilton, who played a tremendous historical role. We, of course, raised the issue of the need for new mass workers' parties in the 1994, 95. And we're the last ones, it seems, to get it. Everybody else has beaten us, if you like, to the punch, as described in a broad sense. We've not consolidated, or the Trotskys have not consolidated their positions where they've had the opportunities. Our efforts, however, with a small force, have paid a huge dividends in South Africa. We now have, standing in this election in the next couple of months, 1, 2, or even more MPs or polls, maybe even overtaken US in terms of representation on the parliamentary plane itself. Look at the effect that we've had, for instance, in relation to NUMSA and the winning over of Moses Mayakiso to our organization. He was with us in the early 1990s itself. It's one thing to pose the question of a new party. It's another thing to realize it. Even in India, with the development of the Common Man, we see the way the Common Man party, that's an indication of the way a new party is taking shape at this moment in time. And undoubtedly, in Italy, in Latin America, and in other fields, we will see the emergence of these parties. These are not the last word. These are not the end of the process. It gives the possibility, within the framework of such parties, of building a powerful organization of our revolutionary international. We see the way we've done tremendous work in PASOL, where we were instrumental in the forming of PASOL. I don't have time to develop what is happening in Chile. It will be dealt with in the international report, in Venezuela and in Latin America as a whole. So far, we've developed on an extensive scale, extensively, if you like. We have more than 45 sections of the CWI. Very difficult, by the way, to actually service all of those sections of the CWI with the small forces we've got. But in some countries, we've begun at least intensive work in the sense of developing a mass force, of developing the basis of a mass party, if you like. In Ireland, with our parliamentary representation, there's now new possibilities, as we saw on the video in the US itself. This represents a colossal step forward for us. It's very difficult to communicate to the comrades here what this means for our international in terms of Latin America, for instance, or in Asia, or in Africa, or in Latin America, oppressed by the power of imperialism, often feeling the boot of US imperialism on their necks, like in Iraq and in the Middle East. Now, in the belly of the beast, this organization of a handful of people has got, for the first time in 100 years, a councillor that's got as much power, by the way, in Britain as an MP, got 100,000 votes, where, if the comrades can correct me, was more than what we got in the whole of Liverpool at the height of our struggle. How did this organization of a tiny handful of her people achieved this? Well, the hour has come. Events has prepared the American working class for us, for the CWI and our programme. Why? Because the American working class is not bowed down by the baggage of social democracy or of Stalinism. It doesn't have to overcome that. It's a fresh, in a sense, new working class with the ideas of socialism, of a struggle under $15 an hour, can take root in the American working class and spread like a prairie fire throughout the length and breadth of the US itself. And it was the audacity and the intervention of our comrades there, based upon the general principles of the CWI. But it took the improvisation and the initiative of our comrades in the US to develop this work. Comrade Dave Reed has played a tremendous role, as Matt Dobson had in visits to the US in the recent period. We've launched all kinds of youth into America to try and seize the opportunity that is developing there. 2 comrades will go to the US in the next period itself. Our US section has gone from 330, has gone from 200 at an IEC meeting in December to 330 now, 500 in a month, when myself and Linda Taaffe will go to Seattle for a monster $15 an hour demonstration and campaign, and perhaps 200 members of our organization in the US gathered together in Seattle. We've mushroomed in terms of branches. We've said to people who wanted to be with Socialist Alternative, set up a branch, send your people to Seattle, we'll discuss with you, and in that way we'll begin the framework of an organization. Many of the people who will join might be disappointed a little bit later on. Some will join, some will drop by the wayside. But we have to seize these opportunities with both hands at this moment in time. It was Archimedes who, after all, once said, "Give me a lever and I will move the world." That's what we're doing in the US at this moment. We're not utopians. We can form a catalyst for developments on a massive scale. Situation in the US is a bit like what it was in the 19th century. When you have Robert Reich, the Labour Secretary in Clinton's government, in Clinton's presidency, actually coming out for the $15 an hour campaign, that's an indication of the way that this can catch fire. Because sections of the bourgeois want to introduce a minimum wage to actually extend the market, as I said before. You had also Boehner, the leader of the House Republicans in the Senate, who's actually threatened to kill himself if the minimum wage is implemented. Our comrades in the US have got up a petition for assisted suicide in this case. The Labour leaders are compelled to come behind our party, and we welcome them. Some of them have betrayed strike after strike. They're prepared to sign on for this, $15 an hour, with committees at the base organised, fine. They will break with us. In fact, it's already beginning. The bourgeois is beginning now to come into opposition. The microphones will be turned off. The TV cameras will stop playing when they learn the full scope of what we're trying to do in the US at the present time. We seized the time. Just as in South Africa, we had the position on a new mass workers' party for 20 years. In fact, in a way, you could say that we put forward the idea of a new mass workers' party before we did in 1995. Because I wrote a pamphlet on South Africa in which we raised this idea in relation to NUMSA's position. NUMSA had the position of a workers' party before the ANC came to power. So we are tying together the knot of history. But you can have a programme in general. In politics, timing is of the essence. When Alec Thraves was sent by the CWI to intervene in the Rustenburg strikes, in the course of that discussion, he put forward the idea of WASP. It took float. It wasn't without resistance. We had to go back in another visit, and some comrades were sceptical. But events and our arguments convinced them. So timing is of the essence of seizing the opportunity to go forward in the situation that we see developing. We will get no help from the bourgeois in the long run. They're compelled to give us publicity. at least in America. But when a report appeared in the Observer a couple of weeks ago, it was about a struggle for a minimum wage in a little town near to Seattle, a small town. And he said the mayor was organising a petition. Not a word about Sharma. In other words, a blackout, while throughout the US and even in the neo-colonial world, in a sense, Sharma is the most famous member of the CWI, even though she's only been a member in our ranks for about 5 years. But the shutters will come down. They'll try, and maybe even the personal safety of comrades will be in jeopardy. There will be attempts to try and crush the effect that we've already had. Same goes in relation to South Africa. But once we get a base, it'll give us huge opportunities then to extend the position. WASP may not be the last word. It could develop into a broader formation in which we would be in a minority. We would welcome that if it's involving the trade unions. We said that before, by the way. We said it in relation to the Labour Party. And what inevitably happened is when people joined the Labour Party, they came into the orbit of our organisation and they joined our organisation itself. Comrades, economically, socially and politically, the ground is being prepared for us, for the CWI. Climate change is a huge concern. We've seen the effects in Britain in the last period. Humanity could possibly have passed the tipping point. I'm an optimist, as Marxism is an optimistic philosophy. But even if you're a bit doubtful about what has happened and you're doubtful about climate change, we cannot afford to risk it. We have to take measures in order to prevent what is happening internationally. The bourgeois will never be able to do this. We have to intervene with the transitional programme on environmental issues as well. A massive alienation of the youth is now beginning to result in a big shift in consciousness, reflected in Seattle, reflected in South Africa. We have a huge prize here, by the way. Imagine if we can conduct a successful campaign for $15, and it could be taken up by other people, maybe even taken out of our own hands, with us acting, if you like, as stewards from below. That would represent a colossal step forward. Europe is now going through a certain lull. The capitalists have won the first few rounds, but that will change. Social conditions cannot continue without explosions, and that involves Britain as well. It's no accident that other revolutionaries have beaten the path to our door. We had 3 visits from Latin American comrades recently, from a comrade from Mexico, from a comrade from Brazil, and from the MPs from Argentina who won in a broad front. 3 of them were elected. They went on a world tour and they made a point of coming to see the CWI. That's because of their work, but it's also because of our work. It may pose the possibility of some kind of federation of like-minded Trotskyists internationally. We may not agree on everything. We need to discuss to see where we can agree and where we disagree, but at a later stage, in some kind of federation of genuine Marxists. There are thousands and even tens of thousands of fighters who are looking for a workers' international. We can assist in this programme. It doesn't mean the abandonment of our ideas, of our methods. The ground has been prepared for mass workers' parties and a mass revolutionary international as well. It must be based on the working class, which will be compelled to struggle. It's not theoretically ruled out that a new equilibrium for capitalism could be established. But what would that take? That would take Greece on a European scale, with the barbarism that we've seen in Greece. It would mean the defeat of the working class, the likes of which we've not seen in Britain, in Germany, France, and so on. That is unlikely, to say the least. That could then open up a new phase, if you like, on the bones of the working class and its organisations. But that is impossible without mass outbursts. That is impossible without the development of revolutionary opportunities. That is impossible without us seizing the opportunities to go forward. That's why Lenin and Trotsky were so confident. They didn't have huge forces, but they had the vision of the process of revolution. And they understand that's not enough in itself, because then the strategy, the tactics and the organisation has to be posed when the hour is struck. One good thing about this crisis is it's removed, or begun to remove, some of the small organisations, the undergrowth, if you like, that complicates the ground below our feet. It's preparing the way for a mighty development of the genuine forces of organisation. Impatience is just another form of opportunism. That unfortunately took place with some of the comrades in Scotland and others who left our ranks. They could not take the pace. They could not dig in and defend the revolutionary perspective in difficult periods. And there have been very, very difficult periods. We did, as an organisation, as a party in Britain and as an international. And now we are in the process of laying the basis of reaping the fruit that now will develop. The socialist revolution, I hope I can bring this home forcefully to the comrades, is not the task of the next 100 years. This could be posed, and posed very sharply, over the next number of years. There's no time to lose. We will see socialism in the 21st century. If we don't, we'll face terrible capitalist barbarism that will put the events in Greece in the shade. Look at the figures on slavery. Twice the number in the world today at the time of the Atlantic slave trade itself. It's a horrific fact. 500,000 people killed themselves in debt-ridden peasants, killed themselves in India because they couldn't pay the debt. That didn't free them because their families were forced to pay the debt. That's the reality of capitalist society. If the working class takes power in alliance with the poor masses in the urban areas and in the countryside, then a new society on socialist lines will begin to open up. This will result in undreamed of plenty for humankind. Even in its first phrase, tremendous possibilities will loom. A society of solidarity, of love in place of the dog-eat-dog society. It is one that is worthwhile fighting for and devoting all your energies to. The response to us, to Seattle in our ranks, has met a marvellous reaction from the comrades himself. We can achieve a mass party. We can build the international. In that way, we are laying the foundations of mass parties through this Congress at this time. We learn from the past. We seek to avoid the mistakes of the 20th century. And we'll write a new glorious chapter in the history of the working class and of humanity as a whole. Thank you.